Good afternoon and welcome to today's workshop on addressing racism in schools in small and rural communities. My name is Melanie Bailey and I will be chairing today's session on K-12 anti-racism initiatives. I'm speaking to you from the unceded Mi'kmaq territory of Epigwit, Prince Edward Island. Epigwit is covered by the historic treaties of peace and friendship. We pay our respects to the Indigenous Mi'kmaq people, past, present, and future. It is an honor to chair today's workshop on an important but difficult topic. For me, the positive within this difficult work is that there's many highly committed and knowledgeable people that have prioritized this and are taking action to tackle K-12 racism, several of whom will be speaking to you today. It is a difficult topic because we know that K-12 racism is creating trauma in our youth population. It's a topic that evokes difficult feelings, and for a number of us, it is triggering, whether you've personally experienced, or in my case, had a child experience. In either situation, this topic carries many difficult memories and experiences. I know this may be the case for those of you taking part in this workshop today. And so before we move into some heavy topics, I'd like to invite each of you to take a deep breath now. And when you find it difficult to listen or to process, please just take another breath. I hope you will be encouraged to know that the speakers here today and a number of you participating are all working hard to tackle racism. Before we move into the speakers, let me set the context. Today's learning event is part of a virtual workshop series, which is, it follows an annual conference that comes every November, all of which are organized through the Pathways to Prosperity, P2P network, and Western University. You are invited to join next November's P2P conference in person or virtually, which will give you free access to all of these workshops that follow. Today's session has emerged from the Pathways to Prosperity's Standing Committee on Immigration to Northern, Rural, and Remote Communities, where members voted to prioritize what they would like to collaborate on, and this topic was one of two selected. During collaboration, it was realized that more research and an environmental scan was needed. And so coming to you today are the findings from that work. These will be shared for the first time with you. Why is school-based anti-racism work so important? Why are we here today? We know that the school system is a key institution when it comes to the integration of newcomer families, and that small communities face unique challenges in addressing racism and discrimination in schools. And of course, school is where children spend most of their day. Our goals today are to initiate further Canada-wide sharing and dialogue on K-12 anti-racism initiatives, to share insights and prepare you for pushback when doing anti-racism work, to share practical tools, videos, and curriculum available to those in Canada seeking to tackle racism, and finally, to share the research around anti-racism practices in K-12 schools in small and rural centers in Canada. And now, introducing our speakers. The first presentation will be on large-scale public commentary, understanding public responses to anti-racism education through social media, presented by Dr. Michelle Lamb. Michelle is the director of Brandon University Center for Aboriginal and Rural Education Studies. Michelle is the co-host of the Leaning In and Speaking Out podcast, has developed a board game called Refugee Journeys, and produced a series of educational films on anti-racism. The second presentation will be on newcomer integration in schools, an opportunity for diversity training, presented by Mark Valad at Toronto Metropolitan University. Mark is a PhD candidate in policy studies and a former fellow researching immigration in smaller and remote communities. Earlier, he earned a master's in public administration while doing work for a regional development agency in Quebec. In 2018, Mark worked on a small center strategy for IRCC, and in 2021, Mark was a visiting professor at Brandon University conducting research on immigrant adaptation in rural areas. The third presentation will be on anti-racism practices in K-12 schools in small and rural centers, presented by Dr. Natalia Brown at Nipissing University. Natalia is an associate professor in the School of Business and the Department of Political Science, Philosophy, and Economics at Nipissing University. Natalia is the chair of Pathways to Prosperity Standing Committee on Immigration to Northern, Rural, and Remote Communities. Natalia's research focuses on the integration of newcomers to small and rural communities in Canada. In a moment, I will be inviting our first speaker, Dr. Michelle Lamb, to start. Before I do that, just a reminder to all that are participating in this workshop today. There will be a 15-minute Q&A that follows the third speaker. Please submit your questions for the Q&A in the tab beside your chat function. Beside that, you'll see the Q&A button. If you could submit your questions there throughout the presentation, and if you can go in there to vote on the questions that are of interest to you. At this time, we'd like to start our workshop with Michelle Lamb.
Thanks so much, Melanie. So to begin, I want to place myself into this work. So I am a white woman talking to you today about anti-racism, and that carries some things. So I recently had the experience of reading a memoir that was written by my great-great-grandfather. It was found in some family documents that we were going through, and it describes taking an ox cart from southern Manitoba up into northern rural Manitoba, where there was land waiting for him, claimed under treaties that still carry responsibilities for me today. So that land, which is now Treaty 2, it's the unceded territory of the Dakota peoples and is considered Treaty 2, which is signed by the Cree, the Oji-Cree, and Anishinaabe, and it's the homeland of the Métis Nation. And so that's where I am coming to you today. And I want to share with you why it is that I'm doing this work. So I grew up in a small farming town in Western Manitoba, and there wasn't much to do in my little town. There's about 80 people who live there, so it's technically a hamlet. And on Saturdays in the winter, my family would go cross-country skiing through the bush in a valley about 15 minutes away. And I was the middle kid, which meant that my dad and brother would be out of sight taking the trail in front of me somewhere, and my mom would be pulling my baby sister in a sled behind me somewhere. And I would be somewhere in the middle, just kind of skiing over one hill down the next and hoping that I'd come out in the right spot. And I can remember vividly the moment when it occurred to me that I was very alone. I knew enough to know that if you get lost in the bush, you should stay where you are. I knew enough to know that. I was probably about 8 years old. And so I stood there until my hands and my feet got cold. But nothing was familiar. I couldn't hear anything. It seemed like no one was coming. And now, obviously, here I am. Eventually, I made my way out of the bush. I found my dad and brother waiting for me. But that moment of being alone in the bush, being scared, made a really deep impression on me. The deepest cry of my heart in that moment was how I wished there was someone who knew where I was, even a single person who saw me, who knew how I was feeling, who could come alongside me. And I feel that very strongly still to this day. No one should spend their lives feeling invisible or powerless or overlooked or like they don't belong. And now as a researcher, I'm still drawn to projects which visibilize that which is so often overlooked or invisible. And so for rural Canadians like me, people who hadn't experienced racism growing up, the average Joe who manages the local co-op or farms, they don't always see the very real complexities and barriers faced by individuals around them, by children in their schools, by staff trying to get into those schools. They don't see the struggles of kids coming home crying because their classmates called them racist names. They don't hear whisper networks of which doctors or restaurants or shops need to be avoided because they aren't safe. They don't feel the pressure of keeping the car in perfect working order because they're afraid of being stopped by the police. They just don't see it yet. And I have to say that before I became an EAL, English as an Additional Language teacher, before I married a man who himself experiences racism, before I began raising biracial children, I didn't see it either. And so I often think, what would I have needed? when I was a child in school. And then there I was, as an adult, a new mom, sitting on a park bench, watching my children play, holding a baby in my arms. There's fresh spring breeze, mid-morning sun. I was feeling all peaceful and indulgent watching these children play. I began to notice another mother across the park. Her children had approached mine to play on the climbing area, and she redirected them over to the swings. And when my children came near the swings, she redirected her children over to the seesaws. And I watched this for a while, this mother shepherding her children away from mine. And then it occurred to me that she hasn't connected me, this white mother on the bench with the baby, with those children over there. To her, those racially ambiguous kids were unsupervised and unsafe. And I became painfully aware in that moment, in the middle of that sunny park, that my children were going to occupy a world vastly different than the one I grew up in. And so this became a kind of burning question for me. What does it take to see that which has been invisible? Like I said earlier, what would I have needed when I was a child to unsettle those things I once thought were true? And the first thing I want to bring you to is this whole idea of belonging. Maybe where you're sitting on Zoom is a place where you feel like you're home, maybe not, but where is it that you feel like you belong? Where is home? Just take a moment and think about that. What does belonging mean to you? Now, in 2021, I led a group of 125 community members. We were meeting on Zoom back then, and there were teachers, students, government folks, nonprofit workers, Indigenous folks, settlement workers, newcomers, healthcare. It was a wide swath of our community. And I asked them to write in the chat the answer to this question: what does belonging mean to you? And this image on the screen is a compilation of all of their responses, the bigger words being the ones that appeared more frequently. So if this beautiful arms outstretched image is what belonging feels like, feeling free, included, respected, being home, being safe, connected, and welcomed, if this is the goal, why aren't so many people feeling that way? Why is it that 84% of Manitobans, people in my province, still say that racism is a problem in their area? And what strikes me about that is this: there is a vast gulf between that beautiful rhetoric of belonging and the actual practices that foster it. And so we launched a research project with that aim of visibilizing, with that aim of making it more clear. And I'm going to share a video with you from that project. It can be difficult to watch, even though it's just under 2 minutes long. Please remember to take care of yourself while you're watching. Take breaks if you need to, and let's watch together.
My husband and I immigrated to Canada for a better life, but it hasn't been easy.
I would like the double cheeseburger deal, yeah?
I've faced a lot of hardship and discrimination.
You immigrants are useless. Go back to your own country.
Gusto lang yan, Han. Kakaraos din tayo.
Is there maybe another position for me? Even though this is not a problem I created, I continue to fight for the sake of my family.
Now, this can be a difficult film to watch, even though it's so short. And I want to tell you a little bit about how it was made. First, we surveyed 500 Manitobans. We asked them, much like an incident report form, we asked them to describe a time they either witnessed or experienced racism, and they shared those stories with us. And from the common elements in those stories, we created 4 film scripts. So you just saw one focused on racism towards newcomers. There are 3 others: anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, and Islamophobia. And these film scripts were read in focus groups to further refine them. And then filmmakers who had lived experiences with the subject of each film were hired to create them. The filmmakers further refined those scripts, bringing their experiences and knowledge to the process. And after those films were created, another series of focus groups were held, which included questions about what recommendations should we include in accompanying toolkits. And from those recommendations and from the research of the team, we created this package of toolkits, one for each film, along with a facilitation guide about how to use the films in classrooms or for professional development. The films were launched on social media in January 2022. They were promoted again through our network, and we began using the films in classrooms and with different organizations, collecting feedback through a final survey. So far, the films have been viewed about 500,000 times, generating a lot of comments. If you want to know more about that, we have a full survey report and a final report up on our website, and I'll share a link at the end. And I also at this point want to take a moment just to acknowledge that this project was very much a team effort, and I hold immense gratitude to all of these people and many more who made this possible. It wouldn't have been possible as a one person to be able to do all of this. And so in that same survey, we asked people this question: how often do you experience discrimination because of race, culture, or religion in these situations? They had to rate between very often, sometimes rarely, or never. And this chart displays the percentage of respondents who answered very often, or sometimes in each of these places. So do you remember that beautiful image of what belonging should look like, that feeling included and respected and safe and welcomed? This is the opposite of that kind of belonging. And yet look at education. This is my field. I'm in the faculty of education. And look at those numbers. This is the opposite of what belonging should look like. And so, as I said, in that final phase of the project, we launched them on social media. We wanted to know how people would respond to these kinds of educational films. And many people shared examples of their own personal experiences of racism. There were a lot of positive things, stories of resilience, responses to other comments that were creating more awareness, people educating others, standing up against hate. There were lots of sort of general, like thumbs up, comments like, this is excellent, very general things. On the other hand, in addition to the opposite, the general negative comments, we saw examples of white supremacy, personal insults, furthering negative stereotypes, fear-mongering, defensiveness, blaming, unsolicited advice that minimizes the realities that were being shared. The negative comments on all 4 of the films were deeply harmful, particularly on YouTube. We had them on YouTube and TikTok, and then shared through many other social media streams, and it seemed that YouTube was particularly harmful. Now, when we analyzed these comments, we found that they fell into particular categories. And we used this metaphor of a conveyor belt to help explain what we were seeing in the data. So I'll give you a couple minutes just to read this quote from Beverly Daniel Tatum. So with this quote in mind, we put all of the comments we were seeing into this image of a conveyor belt. We took all of the racist social media comments, we grouped them into themes, and we made this image. And yet, within this type of environment of these kind of toxic, harmful comments, within that, we saw significant actions where people were taking it upon themselves to create awareness about racism by educating others, by standing up against the hateful comments and the racism they were seeing, sharing their own experiences, and many examples of resilience in the face of racism. And so we illustrated these as people moving against the flow of racism and the actions that you can take against that sort of conveyor belt that carries you along if you don't do anything. And I recently spoke with one of the research assistants involved in this project. She told me that some of the interviews she conducted with participants lasted for more than 2 hours. And for some of them, that was the first time they'd been able to share their stories. We had gotten some media coverage when the survey first went out, BU researchers collecting stories of anti-racism, that kind of thing, or stories about racism. And so when people heard about the project, they began calling and emailing, wanting their stories to be heard, which of course was great as researchers, but for my research assistant, it meant hours and hours of listening to incredibly painful, heartbreaking stories. And yet she chose to continue listening, continue empathizing, continue documenting. And what I want to say about that is this: sometimes it can be really difficult to see. We may see things about the world that are difficult to carry. We may see things about ourselves that make us uncomfortable. But just like my research assistant's choice allowed for those participants to share their stories, some for the very first time, it also allowed these films to be made, which carries those truths farther and wider, allows for people in comments to educate one another. And that's where I find my hope. So every time I go back to my rural community, I have some kind of similarly frustrating conversations about how rural places are feeling abandoned, things aren't like they used to be, disinformation is tearing us all apart. And I can sometimes get into this kind of dark place. But I'm reminded about my students, many of whom are rural people who are still dreaming about education, how to make the world a better place, educating even in one small comment. And I think it's something incredibly powerful. So in the same spirit of my students who dream and move forward, let's take action to dream of a world without racism. And what do you need to be able to work towards that goal? What resources do you need? First, learn. We have huge resources huge toolkits of resources on our website. There's a QR code there that you can follow, or I'll put the link up in the Q&A. All the videos we created are free. They're available on the website and on YouTube. Second, lead. So if you're in a position to lead or facilitate anti-racism work in your community or in your organization, we created a facilitation guide with that in mind, that someone would be able to take it even if they've never done this before, and it guides you through step by step. And then finally, share these videos. These are real stories of real people. Share these resources, what you find helpful to you. And the thought that I'd like to end on is that when we're willing to fully see each other in that full aspect of our humanity, we regain a kind of humanity of our own. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Mark.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see my screen. I will start with a quote, open quote. "We know all the trees in the forest, but we know nothing about people who came and joined us from abroad," end quote. This is an honest say from a research participant in a remote community that highlights how local born settlers, which I further call quote unquote old comers, need to open themselves to the identities and experiences of newcomers. I engage in research rightly because I wish to critically contribute to the questioning and development of attitudes and capacities regarding immigrant settlement in smaller towns and rural areas. To set the table, there are a few things I need to discuss. First, because of the design of immigration policies, immigrating to Canada is very much a family venture. Therefore, immigrants plan this big move with and for the benefit of all of their family members. Second, you've probably heard this again and again. Integration is conceived as a two-way street principle in our own settlement policy. But how many times have we really reflected on what entails this other way, that is the way that concerns us, the old comers? And third, a school is a miniature society. People come there with existing mentalities, values, and biases about the world. It is also a place to learn and experience new things and relationships. So because of what I just said, particularly that schools are at the core of each immigrant's family's experience, as they are for old-comer families too, you can better appreciate why schools are central, if not capital, to immigrant adaptation and integration. The data I rely on to build and support a normative stance for my talk is based, among other things, on 2 series of semi-structured interviews conducted in 2 different settings. The first group being in a Toronto big city context, and the second group in the context of a smaller community lying in the prairies, which is Brandon, Manitoba, and its surroundings. Among these, I had the chance of interviewing 14 immigrant teens and hearing various accounts of newcomer kids in school as told by their parents and teachers. So my main objective today is to outline why it is important for schools to be directly involved in newcomer integration, and to emphasize that in so doing, an incredible opportunity for EDI training shouldn't be missed. Let's start then with a few short stories gleaned from this data. Here is Katya, a Syrian girl who arrived in Mississauga at age 7. She was driven to school only 2 weeks after landing with absolutely no spoken English. Her home class teacher paired her with right away with an Arabic speaking student who had been there since kindergarten. This allowed her to always be with someone who could tell her what was going on, where things were, how the schedule worked, cafeteria, and so on. Her teacher made sure Katya was enlisted in the Right English for Beginners mini group at school, where she would spend a couple of hours every day. Katya always felt supported by her teacher, rapidly knowing that she could go to her whenever she had questions. This was indeed a safe place for Katya to deal with insecurities when they arose. Making rapid progress during this first year, Katya's motivation for school and for learning grew rapidly. She made great strides with her English and other subject matters and pursued her schooling with confidence for years after. Alberto, on the other hand, arrived in Toronto at age 15. He had studied English in Bolivia the year before coming, but that wasn't enough for him to be fluent. As he entered high school, he was placed in a regular class with no tutoring help whatsoever. Alberto felt shy and limited, laying low in the back of the class, unable to follow adequately or making friends. Nobody really minded him as long as he was quiet. One day, he was asked to read out loud in class. Alberto was laughed at and ridiculed by classmates for his strong accent. The teacher didn't intervene and just continued his class. Alberto felt humiliated and recoiled even more. He hung out with out-of-school Latino kids, ditching classes, doing drugs. He was arrested and prosecuted for possession. He finally dropped out of school and at age 22 was still unable to find or keep a job. His mother felt resentful at a system that had failed her son from the beginning. Now this is Akisi, an Ivory Coast girl who arrived in Nipawa, Manitoba at age 13. Raised by her single mother in a refugee camp, she didn't have much schooling to begin with, and her second language was French. Since this was the community that sponsored her family, she had no choice but to enter middle school in English. Offered some part-time tutoring, Akisi had a really hard time learning English and keeping up with classes. The only Black girl in school at the time, Akisi didn't make any significant friends. She was even teased or soft bullied at times, reminded that she was different, Black, and struggling with school. These years were like hell for her. She felt like a dead weight. Akisi was so glad to move out, and by age 18, after barely completing high school, got a first job at a hog plant. With that, she became her family's breadwinner, her mother's being chronically depressed and sick. The last story is that of Kabiru, a 12-year-old Nigerian boy arrived in Brandon, Manitoba in 2019. Kabiru had a good schooling background and was supposed to start his 9th grade. But because of his age, he was put in a 7th grader. More embarrassing, he was forced into an English as additional language class to catch up. But after all, English was his first language, did he say? But it took a month for the instructor to realize he was literally losing time there. Kabiru made a friend during this first semester, a Pakistani immigrant who came to talk to him, as opposed to other white kids who seemed too shy or indifferent to engage. As a result, he felt these kids didn't like him. Still, other kids chatted with Kabiru going back home in the afternoon, explaining to him the basics of hockey, which he liked hearing about. They invited him to try it out, but he had to decline since he never really skated before, didn't want to embarrass himself. Then the pandemic broke out and everyone was sent home. Zoom classes aren't the best context for making connections. Going back to in-person learning, Kabiru was hoping that classmates would be forthcoming enough to come and talk to him. Okay, from these stories, we can already draw a few significant takeaways. First, most newcomer kids are propelled into a classroom within approximately a month from arrival. Following, school professionals have to deal with newcomers' levels of education and language skill and help them integrate regular classes as soon as possible. But not all schools enforce such an approach. Resources can be distributed unevenly, and protocols may even vary within the same school board. In many cases, and this astonished me greatly, some schools won't do anything and assume that kids can cross these hurdles by themselves. Second, newcomer kids, especially racialized, feel the difference they suddenly represent, obviously more so in places where there are fewer immigrants, which is the case in most smaller and rural communities. It doesn't take much then for these kids to feel estranged, ignored, isolated, or even bullied. And having higher ratios of immigrants in classes, such as big cities, doesn't automatically make the adaptation easier, particularly if they are ignored by teachers. Among things that are shown to have a positive impact on newcomer kids joining schools are protocols to proactively help them adapt, which include the proper people to attend them, particularly to acquire language skills. For the sake of these children's well-being, this process should be as friendly and supportive as possible, and when well explained to their parents. Now, complementary to this is that peer relationships are key to acquiring a sense of belonging. So to pair old-comer with newcomer kids from the get-go is surely a good way to start, but it shouldn't stop there. There are attitudes that need to be addressed and shouldn't be tolerated in any context anyway. So not preventing or not intervening can easily become a tacit acceptance of bullying, which is, needless to say, a worst case scenario for integration. In this process, school staff can proactively reflect on their role as what I call integration brokers. For now, I will outline that such a person should strive to represent a safe space for newcomers and be ready to mobilize resources and connections for each kid they assist. Plus, this is a role that should work both ways. That is, also helping old-comer kids grow up in the presence of newcomers and learn to interact in a positive and supportive way. When you come to think about it, isn't this a great opportunity to educate on equality, diversity, and inclusionary values and behavior? The presence of newcomer kids joining schools is indeed a chance to learn to approach differences with an open mind. These differences are among us already, and educating about it should represent more than a textbook chapter. It should also be addressed explicitly within the classroom through the interaction of old and newcomer kids. In other words, integration concerns everyone, and reflecting on it demands to be explicit about behavior, communication, and efforts to include. Furthermore, it can be used as a stepping stone to educate on other aspects of acceptance. In conclusion, I insist that schools and their underlying systems should grab the opportunity of newcomer arrival to help kids, teens, and adults build EDI competencies. Life is diverse, society is diverse, and education should teach us how to approach this fact as something that enriches us, that opens our perspectives, as opposed to cement ourselves in a view that our own little world should only reflect the same. Doing so proactively in the classroom and on school grounds is essential to walking on the lane of a two-way integration. It is also unavoidable to preventing or addressing racism where it can thrive the most, that is, in blatant ignorance. Some major implications for this to take root concern the famous silos in which we often organize society. Education systems, which are varied, this being a provincial competence, are summoned in all communities, big or small, where immigrants set foot to settle with families. What is called for then is more than a curriculum content. Teachers and professionals are invited to train themselves better on EDI matters and embed these values in the classroom. More so, to be able to actively play a broker's role to help newcomer kids integrate the school, teachers must be given recognition and allotted sufficient time for this kind of support. Sadly, the resources and the knowledge that goes with it, for instance, just to teach English as additional language, isn't available everywhere, particularly in smaller areas. Finally, to enhance these capacity, policies and collective agreements shouldn't lay barriers to such an involvement. On the contrary, they should work in collaboration with local communities in their buildup of settlement and integration capacity. So thank you for listening, and I will now turn the screen to Natalia.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mark. It's my pleasure to join you from the land that is the Nipissing First Nation traditional territory and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, lands protected by the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. Now, my motivation for involvement in this project is a bit personal as well. It comes from the experiences of my friend's daughter, experiences of racism in elementary school here where I am in North Bay. My friend had difficulty getting the school administration to take her daughter's experiences of racism and bullying seriously. They eventually handed out suspensions, but they resisted her requests for restorative practices and for anti-racism curriculum and professional development to be prioritized. She eventually left the city, and that was a loss personally, but also it was a loss of skill, talent, and energy for our community because she was a very active citizen. So as Mark said, immigration is a family affair, and schools are central to families in terms of their integration. So our standing committee decided to work on anti-racism in K-12 schools because of 3 factors. First, there's that growing regionalization of immigration settlement. Then there was the evidence that the experiences of newcomer and racialized students in small and rural communities was different from that of large urban areas. And then there's the imbalance in the research focus. The large body of work that exists on anti-racism efforts in schools focuses on large urban areas with diverse populations. So the 2 goals of the project that I would talk about here, we have to understand the experiences of racialized and newcomer students in elementary and secondary schools in these small and rural communities, and also to identify promising practices and strategies for these schools. So we started with a scan of the academic and gray literature. Before I begin, I want to kind of highlight 2 types of approaches that we were seeing in the literature. So anti-racism is an active process through which racism is identified and eliminated and powers redistributed and shared equitably by changing systems, structures, policies, practices, and attitudes. So you can think of the conveyor belt that Michelle spoke about. It has to be an active process. Anti-racism addresses inequalities more so than multiculturalism, which recognizes and celebrates cultural differences and Canada's multicultural heritage, but it does not challenge unjust systems or institutions. So while it aims to eliminate discrimination and promote equity, multiculturalism can breed complacency. Anti-racism asks more of school systems, leaders, educators, and students. Anti-racism recognizes how racism is woven into institutions and can manifest in subtle yet potent ways in schools. So I make that distinction here because in our review, we came across cases of the multiculturalism approach taken by schools in medium-sized and small centers with small but growing populations of immigrant and racialized students. Even in places where anti-racism pedagogy was slowly being implemented by schools, it was buried under multiculturalism discourse. In contrast to anti-racism, the multiculturalism approach may not ensure a full understanding of the history, experiences, or provide criticisms of systems of oppression. Even so, there was evidence that the inclusive activities associated with this approach involving art, music, food, and sport help to meet some of the needs of students, reduce discrimination, and develop common values among students by promoting cross-cultural understanding. These activities promoted the integration of students as they acted as a means of recognition and commitment by the school, helped to break isolation and encourage feelings of belonging to the school. Keys to the success of those activities were community involvement and the emphasis on building relationships. However, the activities were not done with enough consistency required to change the culture inside schools. In addition, to be effective, the pedagogy needs to be less informative and more performative and grounded in the lived experiences of students. Finally, the approach pays limited attention to power relations, so that is not addressed. In small and rural communities with a small proportion of immigrants and visible minorities, racialized students may experience isolation. So Mark read stories about that. And this may be exacerbated by language barriers. In addition to students also may experience conflicts with other students and bullying. Then there's the process of adapting to the school environment and feeling a sense of belonging. And this may be complicated as students deal with dual identities. That is, one that's associated with their family and their cultural heritage, and the new one that they're trying to cultivate at schools with their peers. Teacher expectations are highly influential when it comes to students' attitudes towards learning. And so teachers must be made aware of how race, socioeconomic status, and historical injustices have created perceptions that certain groups of students may be low achievers. Anti-racism professional development is key here in raising awareness and countering potential biases in teacher expectations. And our parents and guardians of racialized students may struggle with their engagement with teachers, staff, and other parents as they try to advocate for their children. Complaints of racism or discrimination may be ignored, downplayed, or not dealt with adequately, leaving parents feeling powerless when it comes to protecting their children from racism. Families have shared that they encountered a hidden or covert sort of racism, and it was difficult to challenge or address. Now, when it comes to education workers, in some of the communities that we looked at, the demographics of the teachers, administrators, and board staff may not reflect the growing diversity of the student population. And when there are racialized teachers and staff, there's a need to address the stress, anxiety, and trauma that racialized educators experience in the workplace. Teachers and staff who are pushing anti-racism in school may not get the recognition for the important work that they're doing, or worse, they may encounter resistance from colleagues, and they might fear reprisals even from the administration or board. There's also evidence that experiencing racism or witnessing racism and systemic racism impacts staff mental health and well-being, which in turn impacts their performance inside and outside the classroom. Many small and rural communities participate in the Settlement Workers in Schools program, SWIS. So you may be familiar with that. And this provides information and referrals and school and community-based resources for newcomer families and students. In small and rural communities, SWIS will help to fill gaps in schools as they may not have access to specialized services. Some SWIS find themselves in the position of providing anti-racism education and education about newcomer and immigrant realities to the school community. For some, intervening, speaking up about racism is complicated by their desire to maintain good relations with teachers and other staff. Some have expressed concern over whether they're doing enough to protect newcomer students from the impacts of racism, while others were experiencing racism themselves while trying to advocate for students. Now, any anti-racism strategy or plan needs to be informed by disaggregated race-based data. In People for Education's annual Ontario School Survey of Ontario's publicly funded elementary and secondary schools, they found that 54% of participating schools in small rural population centers said yes to the question, has your school board collected race-based and/or demographic student data? And this is in comparison to 70% of participating schools in large urban areas. So there's a gap there. When it comes to engaging in professional development specific to anti-racism and equity work, the news is better. 91% of participating schools in small and rural population centers said that they engaged in this, compared to 95% of those in large urban areas. Community partnerships and community leadership are essential as they ensure the voices of those most impacted are front and center when developing solutions. Schools in both rural and urban areas are struggling with this as there is limited engagement with community-based organizations dedicated to promoting anti-racism. The survey results also showed that compared to large urban areas, a lower percentage of schools in small and medium-sized population centers have updated their teaching resources and materials to ensure inclusive and equitable content and representations, updated and reviewed library materials to remove racist or discriminatory content or to increase equitable and diverse content, developed and implemented a school-wide policy on anti-racism, and focused on anti-racism and equity in their school improvement plans. Even so, schools in small and rural communities reported implementing a wide variety of anti-racism and equity initiatives, including the establishment of equity committees, the hiring of equity leads on staff, engaging external consultants to review policies and practices, implementing restorative practices to deal with conflict, and strong engagement with truth and reconciliation learning. Some schools reported making significant gains, especially when school boards made anti-racism a clear priority and provided resources. Others indicated that they were early in the process and in need of more release time, professional development, and resources. A few cited the pandemic and the virtual format as a factor in the slow process. Staff buy-in, getting staff on board, particularly in communities that lacked diversity, was identified as a challenge. In our review, we also came across examples of what taking an anti-racism approach can look like in the classroom. One example comes from rural Nova Scotia. Through their work with middle school teachers in rural communities in Nova Scotia, with a significant proportion of African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq learners, education researchers Mitten and Morior describe how teachers created conditions for students to thrive by encouraging academic risk-taking. Once again, we come back to teacher expectations, which are highly influential when it comes to students' attitudes towards learning and their willingness to take risks. So they stress that teachers' disposition, the incorporation of multicultural content, equal access, and higher teacher expectations were critical to the students' success. The roles played by race and racism were taken into consideration in the implementation of culturally relevant pedagogy and in understanding the students' willingness to take risks in the classroom. So they observed this teachers over a 2-year period, and they observed a set of interconnected teaching practices that were applied consistently, and how this fostered the students' willingness to take risks, to learn, and to ask for support when they needed it. The end result was, greater student achievement. Some of these practices include identifying and recognizing and using academic assets or learning strengths. So these are unique assets that each student brings to the classroom. These impact their self-efficacy and when it comes to taking on difficult tasks or new work. Building relationships to encourage that academic risk-taking and participation. And that might involve taking, including a range of assessment opportunities and keeping in mind the students' identified learning strengths. Acknowledging the student voice and providing meaningful opportunities for students to recognize the power of their voices and how advocacy can work. And fair assessment conditions. And that includes, in the example here, the teachers supplemented written-based assessments with observation and conversation, and provided extra opportunities and time for the students to demonstrate their learning. We also took stock of what schools are doing beyond the classroom. So schools in small and rural communities that collect race-based and demographic data are using the data to identify and remove systemic barriers, to develop reception structures to welcome newcomer children, to raise awareness and overcome staff resistance, to set equity goals, to provide support for professional development and culturally responsive teaching approaches, and guide their programming and purchases of resources. Sometimes staff need to see the data in order to be convinced that racism is taking place systemically and the importance of the work. In the IRCC evaluation of the Swiss program, it was clear that the experiences of Swiss in small and rural communities were different, and that they need specialized resources in recognition of the difference in their access to services and the opportunities for professional development. In addition, school boards, some expanded or encouraged the use of other types of system navigators or other means for empowering parents. That is, building capacity so that parents have more options for culturally appropriate support and mediation within the school system when a conflict arises. In addressing the racism that students may face, it's important not to neglect the impact on teachers and other staff. Anti-racism work is essential to staff well-being. As such, anti-racism work should be central in the design of mental health and well-being plans. At the end of the day, those most impacted by racism should have a voice and leadership in anti-racism work in schools. As we saw, there was a gap in terms of implementation when it comes to community partnerships. Students benefit when there are meaningful partnerships between schools and communities. Supporting those who champion the work is key to the success of anti-racism initiatives. So in terms of our project, there's still a lot left to do, a lot of next steps. In the next phase, we want to interview key informants in order to look into further explaining the implementation gaps between small and medium population centers and what we're seeing in large urban areas, and to determine the best ways to support communities and school boards in addressing these gaps. We also want to look at differences in implementation between elementary and secondary schools, as well as differences across the provinces and territories. Finally, we're going to continue to do our scan for initiatives specific to small population centers and rural areas with the goal of building a database of anti-racism initiatives. Thank you. So now I'll turn it over to Melanie for the Q&A.
I knew each had great insight to bring, but it was even more than I imagined. You all did a phenomenal job. I just invite everyone to open their cameras and microphones now, and I'm going to invite each of you to jump in, but I'm going to go from speaker to speaker. So Mark and Michelle, if you're able to, you can open your microphone and unmute. So we'll start kind of at the beginning. We've got some good questions here in the Q&A. Please add any more if you think of them. I'm just reflecting on Michelle's talk. So of course, Michelle has done incredible work around the videos, which are free for use across Canada. Each of the videos has facilitation guides and material that people can use. You can take it into schools, you can take it into community organizations, use the videos and use the material. Comments here in the chat. Someone else actually has been working on videos as well. So for those of you that are here in the session today, if you just want to note those links, those are some additional resources. It's the third comment down. There's 3 links, additional resources that you could potentially use in your anti-racism work as well. We had a few questions, and I don't know if we have Michelle at the moment, so we may move to you, Natalia.
Yeah, I'm here, Melanie.
You're here?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, good. So in the comments, it said, a beautiful video, had tears in my eyes, really impactful videos. And then there was a question on that first question, but there's a second one as well. I'll read both of them. The first one is, do you have any thoughts on how mediums like making films can contribute to anti-racism initiatives? And how did you and the rest of the team deal with discomfort arising from exploring the lived experience of racism, especially hearing stories like the ones in the video?
Yeah, those are both really great questions. Thank you to whoever has typed those in. It just says anonymous on our side. I'll address the second part first. That idea of how we took care of ourselves in the middle of this project and ongoing. It was really difficult, like reading 500 stories from the province in the last 12 months of how people are being discriminated against, how they're experiencing racism, the things that people are going through. It was incredibly difficult to read that and to then work with that data. Like, we had to go really slowly. We had to take a lot of breaks. We would smudge before we were doing a lot of reading with their Indigenous, that's an Indigenous practice here. And it was very emotionally taxing. We would send texts to people who loved us and say things like, can you check in on us in an hour? Because we're reading some really ugly comments right now. So we would do those things really intentionally, knowing the weight of what we were wading through, particularly in the comments under some of the videos on YouTube. And so I think the strength for us was that we had a really strong team that had worked together we've been together for 3 years, and we've developed a kind of team ethos of mutual care. And so, we had people who said, I don't think I'm up to reading these today. And we would just jump in and cover that person's work. Like, we had that kind of relationship already. And that, I think, made all the difference. And then having those people to support us along the way. And then some thoughts on creative filmmaking and how it fits into research and how it fits into anti-racism. I'll put this up in the Q&A as well, but there's a really wonderful book called How to Make Art at the End of the World. It's on this idea of research creation and this kind of creative activities coming through research and as research. And I think there's so much potential. Like Natalia said in her talk, there are people who need to see the numbers, right? They need to see the data. That's what is going to convince them. And so that's why this was a mixed method study. You know, there's people that need to see, 84% of Manitobans, or need to see that chart of where they're experiencing racism and how it's different for different demographics. For some people, that's really important. For other people, they need one story of someone that they care about. And so this idea that films or things that can kind of grab your heartstrings and tug a little bit, I think have incredible power in moving the people who maybe aren't as moved by the charts and the data. I think both are really important. So I'll put that link to that book up in the chat, and thank you for the question. It's a really good one. They're both good.
Thank you. So I froze and I lost the Q&A, but I do recall a few of them, and I might turn over to one of you to respond with the Q&A. So the next question I had there for you, Michelle, was when you did the survey of 500 Manitobans, how did you reach those 500? What was the process? And how many questions were in your survey?
Oh, good. So our process was, we sent it out through the BU Cares Network. That's the research center here. And we also partnered with several other research centers who shared it through their networks. And then because we got that sort of news coverage, like we were in the local paper and in the provincial paper and the Winnipeg paper, which is bigger, that I think is where we saw a big uptick in people wanting their stories to be heard. We had to change, if there are people in the research world on this, we had to change our ethics protocol because we had initially just been planning to send out this survey and have people respond in that open text box at the bottom about how they had seen or witnessed racism in the last 12 months. But then realizing that a lot of people didn't really want to type these stories into like online, you know, we use SurveyMonkey. They didn't really, so we ended up changing it so we could make phone calls and talk to people personally, which was a lot more time, but it was really worth it. So that's where you heard that story about a research assistant listening for a couple of hours sometimes. That was because of that shift. And in terms of how many questions I'll double check, but I'm pretty sure it was 12. So we had some questions sort of around demographics, and then we had some questions around attitudes. And then we had 2 open-ended questions about sharing a time that they had witnessed and experienced racism. Thank you.
Thank you. That line you mentioned about your researcher taking the calls and hearing about the stories and experiences, and that she chose to continue listening and continue caring, and how many stories she had to listen to. I know we've spoken about that before. Mm-hmm. That definitely stood out to me. Mark, I had heard part of the talk, but it was much more than I thought. This was very helpful, and it really showed the importance of reaching children right away. So, you know, when we think of immigrants arriving in Canada, they normally have weeks and months to adjust, weeks and potentially months to adjust before they go to work in some cases. But kids don't. They go right to school 2 to 6 weeks after arrival. And the rural and small center racialized children feel different. So they need even more support. And children are sometimes left to themselves without interventions, and the danger of that too. Those 2 stories I think stood out to me. We'll get to the questions that were there. I just was reflecting that in your 2 stories, the first and the second one, the first one, the child was a non-English speaker. She was immediately paired with a buddy, with a friend who spoke her language. That buddy helped her connect into the school. She could ask her questions. She was placed with a really good English support program early on to reach her right away with English language learning. And the outcomes were much better. And that sense of belonging comes from that peer relationship, which is what she got right away. In the second example, there weren't interventions. The boy was just dropped in. He wasn't matched with a buddy or a friend, no special English language classes. And furthermore, he got laughed at when he spoke. And the danger in not intervening immediately and not intervening with some of these very practical programs is that child fell through the system, fell through the cracks, ended up in the court system, lost, left behind, and just it breaks your heart that was a child lost. So early intervention, English language, buddy system programming that you mentioned, all very important. You mentioned the good, how you buffer the difficulty was around the peer relationships, early language support, immediate interventions, and that immigration is a family experience and school is where the newcomer youth can be supported. Yeah, thank you. Very insightful, and I learned a lot. So in the Q&A, there were some questions related to, you had two questions actually, so if you don't mind responding. Thanks.
Okay, well, I look at the two questions and I thank for the people who wrote them. The first one is if I have any comments on how highlighting life stories of racism can help community and nonprofit organization or settlement agencies deliver appropriate supports to immigrants and racialized people in Canada. And that's a very interesting question, because in my approach, stories impact people because they are lived experiences. They are good to raise awareness, to sensitize, to open eyes, but they're rarely meant to propose solutions. That's the thing, you know. So once you open your mind and your eyes, then you need to find with your peers in your environment, you know, a way to go further. So indeed, storytelling can bring to the front, but a lot of people don't really want to talk about openly or addressing their ongoing processes. And so I see stories as ideal to understanding the process itself that newcomer kids go through in the process of arriving to a community and adapting to school. Either in video shaped like with Michelle or just storytelling, you know, you can learn a lot of things and feel emotions through stories. And so it's a trigger. But, you know, for instance, you can bring various stories to highlight some constants that appear throughout your data. And that wasn't the point of my presentation, but, you know, in other presentation, I focused on what's the adaptation trajectory of those kids. It's very interesting to see that there are constant where they come as excited to a new place, but very soon they become ambivalent because they feel more isolated, they have problem communicating, and then they see school as a real challenge. And they might develop adverse feeling for the whole process of immigrating. You feel even like resentful towards their parents for having derooted them from their family and then like bringing here to a cold country. And so there is a sort of cultural shock where you see a lot of kids like simply recoil and just not talk for 6 months. And just to give you another idea of how just one sentence can impact, you know, our understanding of this process, I got a quote here from another kid from Brandon who told me, she's a girl, she says, during the first 6 months, I felt like I was watching a movie and I was just one of the characters, not sure it was really me. Wow. Anyway, so that's really like just a sentence can say a lot, you know. Regarding this second question, which turn around, what kind of training can educational institution offer their teachers to help them become efficient integration brokers? And I thank, again, that question. Sincerely, I don't have an answer to that concretely. As I came to this talk, I was speaking more to the why more than to the how. But I have a feeling this should be developed in tandem with settlement organization in the community. You know, open the walls of the school somehow could be a good thing, because we tend to compartmentalize, you know, like create silos, people in their neighborhood, people going to school, it's another world, we don't communicate in between. I mean, immigrant families, they don't feel, and they don't have to enter into these silos. They are actually dealing with all of the novelty and the adaptation they need throughout this space, whether at work, whether at the grocery store, whether at the city, at the community center, or at school. And so I think that this approach should be more structured than one PD once in a while. And because we're satisfied, oh, we did a PD this year. I mean, I'm sorry, then you're just maybe taking the approach of the textbook, but you have to go further than this. And I would sincerely encourage then school staff and teams to literally build action plans on what they feel they need to learn and put in motion for things to change in their environment as a school as a whole, but also each teacher in their class. And as I said, one of the building blocks of this, I believe, from a policy standpoint, is we need to give teachers and staff, the leverage to do so, and the time and the recognition too. So if it's just another box they have to tick on the list of items they need to do or demonstrate during the year without having any recognition, then there's a problem. I will end with this.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. I'm going to move to Natalia. I was really looking forward to hearing the research. It was the first time we got to hear the extent of the findings that had come forward from a project that Natalia was overseeing. And looking at anti-racism practices in K-12 schools across Canada, and then furthermore, small centers are even more challenged. They don't have the same resources. They don't have as many resources. And oftentimes the resources that might be in the community might not even be accessible in the schools in some of these small centers. So they don't have potentially the support that's needed to tackle racism. Your comment around anti-racism is action-based, multiculturalism can lead to complacency, looking at different types and approaches to the work within schools was really interesting to consider that active-based versus letting programming happen. The Swiss workers stood out to me as being a very important initiative that IRCC has that helps get support into schools, but I am aware that not all small centers have Swiss workers. You'd mentioned a couple things around lack of racialized K-12 staff, the staff needing that mental health and well-being support because of the difficult work they're doing. I think anyone working in anti-racism work, that applies to them as well. Recognizing, resisting fear of reprisal. We have a question related to that. We'll get to that. And that Swiss recommendation, all very, very interesting. And of course, all of the information you have related to programming across Canada, we'd love to share that, and that you can speak to maybe potentially where we can follow that research. And that comment about in the classroom, recognizing the unique, specific talents and skills that each student brings and leveraging that is very interesting. So if you don't mind just reflecting on a few of those questions you see there in the Q&A.
Right. Thanks, Melanie. Right. So thank you for your questions. I think the first two questions, I can probably answer them together. One question asked about dealing with power imbalances, especially for racialized newcomers, and also what kind of best practices we're seeing. I haven't come across a demonstrated, tested best practice. What we've seen is a lot of promising practices. There's not enough data to say that one thing will work in every, population center. But one thing that I keep seeing again and again has to do with system navigators or advocates, and also the use of restorative practices. So the system navigators or advocates helping empower the parents and the students when it comes to raising issues with the schools, with teachers, with other parents. And in terms of using restorative practices versus a more punitive type of response to bullying or racism, because it's more of a long-term solution. And at the end of the day, you're going to potentially build relationships. So with the restorative practices, you could go from the very formal with a conference between all the parties involved, to something less formal, like having classroom circles where everyday students come in and they talk about what they're walking into the classroom with every day and what they're dealing with and how they feel. And then you can also have things like effective statements, because sometimes people don't know that their actions or the things that they've done, the impact that it has on others, the words that they use and their behavior. So those are the two things that stood out for me in terms of, again and again, we're seeing that being used, having a place or capacity for parents to feel empowered through a system navigator type approach, or the use of restorative practices, so that all parties involved come together and there's actually a long-term solution and learning happening at the end of the outcome of this resolving a conflict. So I answered that question.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, the restorative practices, love to hear a bit more about that. I think that's key, and today was actually the first time I'd heard about that, and several of you have referenced it. So I'd like to thank each of you for bringing the personal stories that really hit home today. Thank you for bringing your insights and your knowledge to us here. I feel like this is the beginning of many more conversations to come. If there are 3 with this insight and work, I can imagine there's many more out there, and looking forward to many other conversations that will follow. Thank you for those joining us today. This does conclude our workshop. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you for the next conversation.